The Rockefellers and the DuPonts are two of the most famous fortunes in America. Yet no one, not Forbes, not the IRS, not the families themselves, can say what either is truly worth. The money never left, but it was deliberately broken into hundreds of trusts and spread across thousands of heirs until no single person owned enough to be counted. What looks like a dynasty slipping off the rich lists is something else entirely. It is one of the most effective disappearing acts in finance. This story doesn't start with a fortune. It starts with a problem. And it's the same problem every big fortune eventually runs into. Money sitting in one person's name is easy to find. And anything easy to find is easy to tax, easy to split, and easy to fight over. A man dies, the government takes its cut, the children divide what's left, and a few rounds of that will turn a great fortune into a comfortable one, then into a story the grandchildren tell at dinner. The old American families watched it happen up close. The Vanderbilts had been the richest family in the country, and within 3 generations the name meant marble mansions, not money. What a few families figured out next is the whole reason the Vanderbilts ended up a cautionary tale, and the Rockefellers did not. The way out they found flipped the European instinct on its head. The old approach was to pile everything into a single foundation or holding company and run it from the top. That works right up until a tax authority decides the holding company itself is the target, and then the whole fortune is sitting in one place with a bullseye painted on it. The American answer was stranger, and it turned out to be a lot harder to kill. Instead of one box holding everything, the family builds 100 boxes, drops a slice into each, hands them to professional trustees, and spreads those slices across children, grandchildren, cousins, and a few heirs who haven't even been born yet. Nobody owns the fortune. Everybody owns a sliver of it. They did this because a sliver is almost impossible to come after. A taxman cannot easily reach what no single person holds. A divorce court cannot split what a spouse never actually owned. And no magazine can put a clean number on the rich list when the money has been cut into 1,000 quiet pieces, each one parked in a different trust with a different name on the door. That last part is the whole game, and it is exactly where this is headed. The trick goes back to a man almost nobody remembers, which is more or less how he wanted it. Henry Phipps grew up poor in Pittsburgh, a few doors down from a kid named Andrew Carnegie. The two went into steel together, and Phipps turned out to be the quiet one who watched the books while Carnegie made the speeches. He ended up owning about 1/11 of Carnegie Steel, the second largest stake in the company after Carnegie himself. When they sold the whole thing to J.P. Morgan in 1901, the deal created U.S. Steel and made a long list of men suddenly, violently rich. Phipps walked away with around $50 million, which in 1901 was a number most people couldn't even picture. A newly rich man in 1901 usually did one of two things with money like that. He spent it, or he handed it to his kids and hoped for the best. Phipps had watched enough fortunes burn down to know how that one ended. So in 1907, he set up a private company in New Jersey whose only job was to hold and manage the family's money, and he built it around trusts for his 5 children. What that quiet New Jersey company turned into is the real engine under this entire story. Phipps named it Bessemer Trust, after the steel-making process that had made him rich in the first place. This was the family office before the phrase existed. Bessemer didn't just invest the money. At one point, it handled the family's maids, walked their dogs, and ran a private train to shuttle them between New York and Florida. Because the whole point of old money was that the family should never have to touch the machinery at all. The fortune stopped being a pile of cash that could be spent or lost. It quietly became an institution with a staff that happened to belong to no one in particular. Once that institution existed, it could outlive Henry Phipps, his 5 children, and everyone who ever shook his hand. And it did. More than a century later, Bessemer Trust is still standing. In 1974, the family opened it up to outsiders, and today it watches over more than $200 billion for over 3,000 wealthy families, acting as trustee on something like 15,000 separate trusts. Henry Phipps turned his own fortune into a company that now guards everyone else's. The original family office grew into an entire industry. Phipps built the machine quietly for one family and kept his name off of almost everything. The most famous family in America was about to build the biggest version of it, and they were not quiet about anything. John D. Rockefeller was the first American billionaire, and for a long stretch, he was simply the richest man alive. Standard Oil refined something close to 90% of the oil in the country before the government broke it into 34 separate companies in 1911. And even after the breakup, the pieces, the ones that would grow into Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, kept printing money for whoever held the shares. At his peak around 1913, Rockefeller was worth roughly $900 million. Measured against the size of the economy back then, that is a level of wealth no American has come close to since. But the money itself was never the clever part. It was what the family decided to do with it. A pile that big becomes a target the moment its owner dies, and Rockefeller knew it. The income tax had just arrived. The estate tax was coming. In 1917, he had already handed his only son, John Jr., $460 million in a single stroke. Then the family did what Phipps had done, except bigger and far more deliberate. In 1934, John D. Rockefeller Jr. locked the heart of the fortune into a set of trusts for his children and put Chase Bank in charge as trustee. In 1952, he did it again for the grandchildren. The 1934 trusts were written to hold the bulk of the family's wealth and not fully unwind until the fourth generation had died off. The structure was built, on paper, to outlast people who in 1934 had not even been born. That one detail quietly rearranges how the whole thing works. The people the world calls Rockefeller heirs mostly do not own the Rockefeller fortune. The trusts own it. An heir collects income, what the old trust language calls suitable support and maintenance, plus a voice in some decisions, but the principle itself is not theirs to sell, to gamble, or to hand to a stranger. The trust on paper is one thing. What it does to an actual heir's life is stranger. One family memoir even laid out the schedule, and it reads like a corporate vesting plan. A young Rockefeller started drawing around $10,000 a year at 21, and the figure climbed on a fixed timetable as the heir got older. A trust fund with a vesting schedule. Everyone outside the family just calls that an allowance. By the living generation, there are roughly 200 Rockefeller descendants, and the money runs through a web of family trusts managed out of a single family office. The same office, in spirit, that John D. Sr. set up back in 1882 to keep his affairs straight. The family's own trust company has been described as managing hundreds of separate family trusts. Hundreds of them for one bloodline. The trusts did not just sit there, either. In the mid-1980s, the family pulled cash out of the original Rockefeller Center, mortgaged and sold off the real estate, and rolled roughly $2 billion back into the trusts, where it could keep throwing off income for the heirs without ever landing in anyone's personal bank account. The shape of the money changed, but who controlled it never did. So when a magazine tries to print a single Rockefeller net worth, it is essentially guessing, because the honest answer is scattered across hundreds of legal boxes, and no one box holds the total. One number in all of this matters more than the 900 million, and it is that one word: hundreds. The next family took the same idea and pushed it until the math simply stopped working. The DuPont started with gunpowder. A French immigrant named E.I. DuPont set up a powder mill on a Delaware creek in 1802, And for the next century, the family ran what grew into the largest chemical company on Earth. From 1802 to 1940, every single head of the company was a DuPont. They didn't just own shares in a company, they basically were the company. At one point, they also controlled up to a third of General Motors, until an antitrust ruling in the 1950s forced them to give it back. But owning the company outright, in the family name, was exactly the kind of visibility that had buried other fortunes. So they built a layer. To keep their grip without each relative holding the stock himself, the DuPonts set up a holding company called Christiana Securities in 1915. Christiana owned a controlling slice of DuPont, around 28%, and the family owned Christiana, one clean layer sitting between the people and the company. That holding company was the strength of the whole arrangement, and it was also about to become the weakness. It worked for 60 years, but by the 1970s, the tax code had turned that one holding company into a liability, the very same trap the Europeans kept walking into. And in 1977, after a long court fight, the family folded Christiana into DuPont and let the structure dissolve. Folding it in did not loosen the family's grip so much as hide it better. The DuPonts kept their stock, kept a seat at the table, and let the single visible holding company disappear into a scatter of private trusts and estates, names like the Alfred I. DuPont Testamentary Trust, that no outsider could ever add up. The DuPonts are where this whole pattern hits its limit. Instead of gathering back into a few neat piles, the fortune kept fracturing, running down through hundreds of separate trusts and out across a family that had simply gotten enormous. By the early 1940s, there were already more than 700 direct descendants of the original patriarch. Today, the number sits somewhere north of 2,000 living DuPonts. 2,000 of them. At that size, the family reunion is less a party than a census. So when reporters try to pin down what the DuPonts are worth, they keep writing the same sentence in slightly different words. The family's wealth is impossible to calculate because it is split among hundreds of branches and locked inside long-standing trusts, with no single person sitting on top of it. And that's not some reporter throwing up his hands. That's the whole plan working exactly the way it was meant to. A fortune no one can count is a fortune no one can tax cleanly, no one can raid, and no one can even envy properly, because no outsider can say how big it really is. 3 families, one move, repeated across more than a century. Phipps invented the machine in 1907. The Rockefellers scaled it. The DuPonts fragmented until the fortune all but dissolved into fog, without ever once leaving the bloodline. Different families, different businesses, but the same basic instinct every time, which was to chop the money into so many pieces that nobody on the outside could ever add it all back up. So where does 100 years of this leave these families now? Pretty much exactly where they wanted to be. The situation today is a strange one. These families still control serious capital. It moves through family offices and trust companies, several of which now manage money for thousands of other rich households and not just their own, and through trusts that quietly hold stock, real estate, and private businesses most people will never hear about. What is gone is the single name on the single pile. There is no one Rockefeller to point at and call the fortune. There is no DuPont sitting on a throne. The wealth did not shrink. It dispersed, on purpose, into a shape that does not fit on a list. Which brings the whole thing back to where it started. The reason no one can say what these families are worth is not that the records went missing or the reporters got lazy. It is that the fortune was deliberately built to defeat the question. A rich list measures what people own, and these families arrange to own almost nothing in their own names, while still steering all of it from 1,000 small rooms. The Vanderbilts held their fortune out in the open and lost it in 3 generations. The Rockefellers, the DuPonts, and the quieter families who copied Henry Phipps did the opposite. 100 years later, they are still here, still in control, and still impossible to count. Fragmentation is the second way a fortune disappears. The first, from last time, was control without ownership. This one is ownership scattered so wide it cannot be measured. But there is a third move, and in some ways, it is the cleanest of all. A few of the richest families on Earth never bothered with a maze of trusts and never hid behind a foundation. They simply made sure their company never sold a single share to the public, so there were never any numbers to find in the first place. Some of the biggest fortunes in the world don't sit in a foundation or 1,000 trusts. They sit inside companies you have heard of and owned by families you have not. That is where this goes next. Wealth Cipher follows the money the rich lists can't, into the rooms where it actually sits. Subscribe. The Cipher has always existed. Now you know where to look.